The stagecoach lurched like a tired animal as it crested the final rise before Dusty Creek, wheels gnashing the rutted road until the whole coach shivered to a halt. Sarah Whitmore breathed through the ache in her belly and pressed her palm against the swell of 7 months' worth of promise. Hannah, 5, blinked at her from the opposite bench with a solemn, dust-streaked face, and Thomas, 3, sleep-mussed and stubborn, clutched the rag horse he'd carried since Kansas. The driver called down that the team needed a rest and a splash, which was his way of saying the horses were done, and so was he. The wind rushed up out of the basin with the smell of sage and iron and something else she could never quite name, like a stove that had cooled but remembered fire. "Is this it, Mama?" Hannah asked, peering past the faded blue curtain, voice caught between worry and awe. "This is it," Sarah said. "Dusty Creek." The name made a small smile move through her, even now. Dusty, yes. Creek, yes. But also a word whispered into the dark when she could no longer speak her husband's name without her throat closing. Home. The driver's boots hit dirt with a thud. "Town's a mile more," he grunted. "You can ride it out or walk it while we ease 'em." Sarah chose to walk. Her knees protested as she climbed down, but the ground felt honest under her shoes. She took Hannah's hand, then Thomas's, and together they moved along the road, while the coach clattered ahead at a gentler pace. Vultures traced lazy loops high above, black commas staining a pale sky. The town lay in the shallow cradle of 2 ridges, a scrape of clapboard walls and signboards, one tall windmill clacking like a metronome for lonely days. A rider appeared on the ridge to the west and held for a moment, no motion, no wave, then disappeared behind boulders scarred by lightning. Sarah kept walking. Kansas had taught her what to fear and what to leave be. Men who wanted to be seen were often cheaper than men who didn't. By the time she reached the first hitching post, the sun had slid behind a veil of thin cloud and cooled the hard light. The main street of Dusty Creek offered what every frontier town offered: a livery with a sagging roofline, a general store with goods stacked in the window like promises, a blacksmith singing sparks over iron, a clapboard church with a bell the color of old pennies, and the saloon, paint peeling in curly ribbons, swinging doors scuffed to gray. The town's name was stenciled in fading letters across a water tower, and below it a child had scratched a crooked heart with a nail. It made her think of her husband's hand on her back the day they staked their claim, the warm press and the surety of it, a surety that had been taken by men who laughed as they rode away. Her breath hitched, then settled. "We're going to buy bread," she said, voice steady, "and soap, and we'll ask where we can sleep tonight." Inside the general store, the air smelled of coffee grounds and rope and tallow. Shelves crowded up to the ceiling, jars of penny candy guarding sacks of flour. A woman with a braid as tight as a bootlace stood behind the counter, tallying kerosene tins with a carpenter's pencil. She looked up, took in Sarah's belly, Hannah's solemn eyes, Thomas's stubborn grip, and something softened in her face. "You look like you walked a long road," the woman said. "Name's Elsie Hart. I keep this place standing when the wind tries to take it." Sarah's voice arrived a moment late. "Sarah Whitmore," she said. "We came from the east." It was the safest shape of the truth she could manage without letting everything spill. "Bread's fresh," Elsie said. "Or as fresh as we get. Soap's near the salt. Water's out back if you need to wash up." Her gaze flicked to the window, then back. "You got a place to stay?" "Not yet," Sarah said. Her palms were damp, her mind assembling a list: roof, heat, safe corner, a door that latched. I'll find a room, just a few nights till I know what's next. Elsie measured her with the same care she used on kerosene. There's a boarding house run by Mrs. Finch, 2 streets north, she said. She's fair, won't cheat you for being new. Elsie leaned in an inch, lowering her voice to the private tone women had used with one another since time began. And if the saloon folk get too curious, answer what you want and carry the rest home. Thank you, Sarah said. She risked a question. You ever hear of someone who helps folks make it through winter up in the mountains? I was told there might be someone like that. Elsie's pencil paused. Stories travel faster than wagons, she said. Some of them outpace the truth. But there is talk. A man keeps a cabin in the high pines beyond Angel's Notch. People call him all sorts of names when they don't know him. Hermit, ridge runner, ghost. I call him what he is when I have cause. Useful. Useful, Sarah repeated. The word felt like a door that could open. Does he take money? Elsie's mouth tipped. Not a smile so much as a seat offered in a crowded room. Depends on the favor, depends on the hour. Some say he's had folks sign a paper for $1 and for their word to work hard. Some say he asks for silence. You'll hear 50 versions by sundown. I've only seen one. A widow who came late one fall when the nights were already biting. She went quiet and thin and then left in spring with 2 more calves in her pen than she arrived with. Make of that what you will. Thomas dropped his rag horse and Hannah scrambled after it, bumping a crate of tin cups that rattled like a warning. Sarah scooped the toy up and steadied the crate. Sorry, she said, the apology a reflex. The kind that had been beaten into her by weeks of a world that met her with ifs and maybes. Elsie waved it off. Win knocks more over than that before breakfast. She slid a loaf and a paper-wrapped block of soap across the counter, and then, after a beat, added a pinch of peppermint sticks to the bundle. For clear throats, she said, and for brave days. A man in a long coat pushed through the door with the cold clinging to him. He gave Sarah a hard look, the kind men used when they wanted you to know they had no reason to be kind. His collar was tight, hat brim sharp as a blade. A badge flashed once at his chest, Deputy. He took a tin of tobacco without asking, slapped a coin down, and turned to her. You just off the coach? He said. Yes, Sarah said. Town keeps a ledger, he said. Names of who comes through, who stays, who leaves. Makes life simpler when folks don't go missing. His eyes held a question and an accusation and a dare. Then put this, Sarah said. Sarah Whitmore with children, looking for work and wintering, nothing more. Her pulse ran fast, but she held his gaze. She'd learned in Kansas that wolves smelled fear better than smoke. The deputy said. Word is... He tapped his temple like he was listening to gossip in his own skull. Word is a gang's been hunting widows in these parts, running them off their claims. Claim jumpers don't always stop at lines on a survey map. Sometimes they cross state lines too. If you've got trouble following you, say so now. Her mouth went dry. The room narrowed to the sound of the windmill outside. I've got children, she said, and I've got work in me. That's what's following me. Elsie shifted her pencil, steady as a metronome. The deputy took his tobacco and a long look at Sarah's belly. Boarding house is fair, he said, not as a kindness, but as a fact he could live with. Stay out of the alley behind the saloon after sundown, and if anyone mentions Angel's Notch, Be sure you know whose ears are open." He left a chill behind him that made the peppermint seem like fire. When the door's bell stilled, Sarah realized her hand had strayed back to her stomach, as if she could shield the child within from history. She forced it to the counter and slid the coins forward. "Thank you," she said to Elsie, "for the directions and for the clear throats." Outside, the street had gathered more eyes. A pair of ranch hands leaned against the hitching rail, one with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "New in?" he said, voice oily. "Dusty Creek's got a welcome for every kind." His friend snorted. "Some more than others." Sarah kept walking. Hannah's fingers tightened like a bird's claw around hers. Thomas asked, very small, "Is that our house?" "It will be," she said. "Soon." They had to pass the saloon to reach the North Street. A piano clanked somewhere inside, cheerful as a lie. A hand-painted sign swung on chains. Gold Star. One of the chains was bent, and the sign tilted like a question that had no good answer. A man stepped out of the shadow of the doorway and fell into step beside her, boots too quiet, hat brim too low. "You got family here?" he asked. "I've got what I need," Sarah said. She didn't look at him. "What you need might be up in the pines," he said. "Beyond the notch. Man there takes in strays, for a price that ain't always coin." "Keep walking," she said to Hannah, her voice a calm river even as her blood beat like hoofbeats. To the man she said, "You talk a lot for someone who doesn't say his name." He laughed once, sharp, broken. "Names get a man killed faster than bullets in these parts." He veered away, but not before letting his coat swing wide on a gust. Inside, stitched into the lining like a secret oath, she saw a brand she knew too well, the same mark burned into fence rails back in Kansas when the land grabbers took what wasn't theirs. The sight punched breath out of her, and for a heartbeat the street wavered, then steadied as if her will had wedged it into place. Mrs. Finch's boarding house smelled of boiled coffee and scrubbed floors. The woman herself was tall, thin as a broom handle, eyes sharp and not unkind. She took them in with a glance and made a decision. "Kitchen's warm," Mrs. Finch said. "Room at the top of the stairs, second on the left. Pay by the week, rules on the door. If the baby comes early..." Her eyes moved to Sarah's belly, softened for a blink. "You won't be the first." In the room, Hannah climbed onto the bed like a cat claiming sun. Thomas lined up his boots and his rag horse and told them both to soldier. Sarah set the bread on the dresser and the soap by the basin and watched her reflection in the warped glass. A woman with wind-tangled hair, prairie brown eyes, and a mouth pressed thin not with bitterness, but with use. She uncurled her fingers and felt the shape of a single coin, a silver dollar tucked into her hem. The last of what her husband had left hidden in a hollow under the stove. $1 to buy a future, or to sign it. Downstairs, a clock struck the hour. 3, then a pause, then 1 like a hiccup. Somewhere beyond the north window, the ridge lifted its dark shoulder against the light. Angel's Notch. Stories traveled faster than wagons. Rumors reached a woman before her hunger did. A man in the pines. A bargain for winter. Her hand went to the coin again, then fell to the bedstead as if to anchor herself to this square of the world. She blew out a breath. "We'll make it," she said, and the room, stripped and simple, gave the word back to her like a vow. Outside, a dust devil skipped down the street and unpinned a flyer from the livery wall. It tumbled end over end until it slapped against the boarding house step. When Sarah bent to pick it up, The paper's ragged edge caught her skin, and the ink bled into her thumb. "Wanted" scrawled above a sketch of a man with eyes like winter river water. She didn't recognize the face, but the reward offered would have bought a dozen winters. She folded the paper, not from curiosity, but from the sudden, precise sense that everything in this town had eyes. Then she straightened, squared her shoulders, and lifted her chin toward the north ridge. If fate had a voice, it was not thunder or choir, just the steady scrape of chair legs on a wooden floor as a woman stood up to go. The Gold Star Saloon was louder than Sarah expected for a place so small. Laughter rolled like distant thunder, mixing with the sour tang of whiskey, the clink of poker chips, and the restless creak of boots on warped floorboards. She hesitated just inside the swinging doors, Hannah's hand in hers. Thomas close at her side. Every eye that turned toward her seemed to weigh her, measure her, and decide what she was worth. Elsie Hart's earlier warning echoed in her mind. Answer what you want. Carry the rest home. A man stood apart from the crowd at the far end of the bar, leaning one shoulder against the wall. He wasn't part of any game, wasn't drinking, and didn't look at anyone, until his gaze locked on her like he'd been waiting for this moment all day. He was broad-shouldered, sun-weathered, with a scar cutting a pale line from temple to jaw. His hat sat low, shadowing eyes the color of deep river water. "Sarah Whitmore," he said, low enough that no one else seemed to notice. "I heard your prayer years ago." Her stomach tightened, not from fear exactly, but from the strange sense that this was not their first meeting. "I don't know you," she replied carefully. "That's true." His voice carried the gravel of someone who had spoken too little over too many winters. "But I know you. You want to make it through the season alive, with those kids of yours warm and fed. I can give you that. For a price." She squared her shoulders. "I'm not for sale." A faint ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "Not you. Just $1. And your work. Cabin needs tending. Wood to split, traps to run, food to put up. In return, I keep you safe. No one touches you or the young ones. Not for the whole winter." Sarah didn't answer right away. She was used to men offering deals that only looked like lifelines until you were tangled in the rope. "And your name?" she asked. "Miles Rourke." He spoke it like it was both truth and challenge. "Most folks up here don't need to know more. You won't find anyone else in Dusty Creek who'll take you in this time of year without wanting something you can't give." Her pulse quickened. "And how do you know my name?" Miles's gaze didn't flinch. "Like I said, I heard your prayer." It made no sense. But the way he said it was too steady to be a joke. Before she could press him further, the saloon doors banged open and 2 ranch hands staggered in, reeking of whiskey and mud. One spotted her and grinned, all yellow teeth and bad intentions. "Look here. New face in town. And not just any face." His eyes drifted to her belly. Miles stepped between them without raising his voice or his fists. "She's taken," he said. "By me." The room went quiet enough for the piano player to stall mid-note. The ranch hand frowned. "Since when?" "Since now." Miles's tone brooked no argument. Sarah caught Hannah's questioning glance but kept her focus on Miles. It was a bold claim from a stranger, but in a room full of watchful predators, it served its purpose. The ranch hands muttered something under their breath and slouched toward the bar. Miles turned back to her. "Do we have a deal?" Her mind raced through the last few months. Kansas burning behind her, the gang's laughter as they rode off with her life, the endless road west, and the cold that had begun to bite at night. The mountains loomed beyond Dusty Creek like a wall, promising both shelter and danger. "How far is your cabin?" she asked. "Half a day's ride," he said. "Far enough from town that trouble doesn't stumble by. Close enough I can get you here if the baby comes early." His gaze shifted briefly to her stomach before returning to her face. $1. "And your word you'll work." "And if I say no?" Miles's jaw tightened, but there was no anger in it, only certainty. "Then you'll find out how quickly word spreads that a widow with 2 kids has no roof for winter, and someone else will come calling. Someone you'll wish you'd never met." She hated the truth in that. She also hated that she didn't have another plan. Slowly, she reached into the hem of her dress and drew out the single silver dollar her husband had hidden before the end. She held it up. $1, she said. "And my work. Nothing else." Miles took the coin, but instead of pocketing it, he flipped it once in the air and caught it, the motion smooth as a habit. "Deal." From somewhere behind the barkeep let out a dry chuckle. "Hope you know what you're getting into, Rourke. Winter's got a way of breaking folks who think they're made of iron." Miles didn't look away from Sarah. "She's not iron," he said. "She's something else." The words left her uneasy, but also strangely steadied. He stepped aside, gesturing to the door. "We ride at first light. Bring only what you can carry. The rest of your life's up there." Sarah gathered Hannah and Thomas and walked out into the chill night. The wind off the mountains smelled of pine and snow to come. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf's howl threaded through the dark. She didn't know if she'd just made the best bargain of her life, or walked straight into the jaws of something worse. The trail up into the high country was a test from the first mile. The air thinned, sharp with the bite of late autumn. Hoofbeats echoed against the canyon walls, mingling with the creak of saddles and the occasional snort from Miles's sturdy bay. Sarah's borrowed mare was sure-footed but slow, and she kept one hand on her belly to steady the weight of the child inside. Hannah rode tucked in front of Miles, small fingers gripping the saddle horn, eyes wide as she took in the winding path. Thomas, restless in the cold, sat behind Sarah in the worn stock saddle, his little boots knocking against her legs. They crossed a narrow wooden bridge where the creek below hissed over ice-fringed stones. On the other side, the trail climbed into thick pines, shadows swallowing the light until the sun was nothing but fractured beams breaking through the branches. "Stay close to my horse," Miles said without looking back. "If the mare spooks, let her have her head. She knows the way." Sarah bit back a retort. The man's voice carried that same mix of command and calm she'd heard in the saloon, like someone used to being obeyed, not asked. She kept the mare in his tracks, her eyes flicking to the ridgelines where wind sifted snow from the trees. By the time the cabin came into view, the light was already slipping. It stood in a clearing ringed by pines, smoke curling from a stone chimney. Not large, but solid. Rough-hewn logs, a roof weighted with cedar shakes, shutters latched tight against the coming cold. Miles dismounted, tying off the horses before helping Hannah down. He handed Sarah a key that felt heavier than it should have. "It's yours now as much as mine," he said. "Long as the deal stands." Inside, the cabin smelled of pine resin, leather, and the faint tang of gun oil. A single room held a stone hearth, a rough table with 2 mismatched chairs, a narrow bed against one wall, and a ladder leading up to a loft. The place was neat but stripped. No clutter, no softness, only what was needed. "You'll take the bed with the children," Miles said. "I'll keep to the loft." She opened her mouth to argue about propriety, about space, but stopped when she saw the faint fatigue in his eyes, the way he avoided looking at her for too long. Instead, she said, "We'll need more blankets." "There's a trunk by the hearth," he said. "Wool and canvas. You'll want to air 'em out before nightfall." The next days blurred into a rhythm of survival. Miles showed her how to swing an axe so it didn't jar her shoulders, how to set rabbit snares without leaving scent, how to listen for the groan of ice under the creek's surface before stepping across. He was patient, if gruff, and never wasted words. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the peaks, they were stacking the day's wood beside the cabin when Miles said, "You were on the Kansas City stage 5 years back." Sarah froze. "I don't remember you." "You wouldn't," he said. "Bandits hit the coach halfway to Abilene. I was riding escort, quiet work. Put down 2 of them before they even got the door open. You were inside, holding a baby." Her breath caught. She remembered the gunfire, the shouts, the door rattling, and then nothing but the sudden absence of danger. She'd told herself for years that someone out there had saved them. She'd never known the face. "Why didn't you say anything then?" she asked. Miles's gaze drifted to the darkening tree line. "Because I was running too, from my own people. Couldn't stick around for questions. Didn't think I'd see you again." The silence between them stretched. She wanted to ask more, but the look in his eyes told her that part of the story still had teeth. It was the next morning that she noticed the first sign. A single boot print just beyond the tree line, too fresh to be old, too heavy to be his. She called him over, but when he crouched to study it, his face was unreadable. "Could be a hunter passing through," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. That night, the faint smell of wood smoke drifted into the cabin, sharper than the fire on their own hearth. Sarah rose from her bed, careful not to wake the children, and crossed to the window, out past the clearing, beyond the reach of the moonlight. She thought she saw a thin thread of smoke curling upward from the trees. The next day, Miles set her to tending the traps alone, while he ranged further than usual with his rifle. When he returned near dusk, his jaw was tight, and there was snow melted into the fabric of his coat. He said nothing about what he'd found, but she caught him oiling the rifle with more care than usual that night. The feeling of being watched settled in like an unwelcome lodger. The children seemed to sense it too. Hannah stayed closer to the cabin, and Thomas grew quiet at night, curling under the blankets without his usual chatter. 3 days later, Sarah went to check the snares and found one sprung, the bait gone, the wire cut clean. Not broken, cut. She carried it back to the cabin and set it on the table in front of Miles. He looked at it, then at her. "They're closer than I thought." "Who?" she demanded. "Men I used to ride with," he said. "And they don't forgive debts or desertion." Her heart thudded. "And they're watching us?" Miles nodded once. "Waiting, testing the edges, seeing how far I'll go to protect what's mine." Sarah stared at him. "And am I yours now?" He met her gaze without flinching. "For as long as you need to be. Long enough to make it through the winter. Maybe longer if you want it." Outside, a branch cracked in the woods. Both of them turned toward the sound at once. Miles reached for his rifle, moving to the door with silent precision. Sarah, without thinking, went to the hearth and took up the heavy iron poker. The crack came again, then nothing. Only the hush of falling snow. Miles eased the door shut and bolted it. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we start fortifying." Sarah didn't ask how much time they had, only began to mentally count the nails, the boards, the ways she could keep the children close. Somewhere out there, in the dark, shadows from both their pasts were moving closer. And winter had only just begun. The storm came in fast, sweeping down from the peaks like a living thing. By nightfall, the pines groaned under the weight of snow, and the wind clawed at the cabin walls with icy fingers. Sarah had never felt such cold. It bit through every layer, found the seams in her clothes, and settled into her bones. Miles had been working since morning, reinforcing the shutters, nailing boards across the inside of the windows, and dragging the heaviest furniture against the doors. "Jed Malone won't wait for spring," he'd said grimly. "If he's been tracking us, this storm is cover. He'll use it." Sarah didn't ask how he knew. She could see it in the set of his jaw. And after the cut snares and the shadow of boot prints in the snow, she believed him without question. By mid-afternoon, the first signs came. A flicker of movement between the trees, just shapes at first, gray against the whiteout, there and gone. Then another. The cold wind carried a voice, faint but sharp. "Miles Rourke!" Sarah's heart tightened at the name. "You've been hiding long enough." The voice was louder now, cutting through the howl of the wind. "Come out, and maybe we'll let the widow and her brats live to see morning." She stood at the hearth, poker in hand, every muscle drawn tight. "How many?" she asked. "6 that I can see," Miles said, loading cartridges into his rifle. "Maybe more in the trees." He tossed her a small revolver. "Not much, but something. Keep it close. You'll need both hands steady." Despite the storm, the gang's voices carried. "This your woman, Rourke? You got yourself a family now?" The laughter that followed was jagged and ugly. Miles's eyes flicked to her. "They want me, but they'll burn the cabin to get me if I don't walk out. That's their way." "Then we don't give them the chance," Sarah said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. He gave a quick nod. "We hold them until they decide the cost's too high." Snow piled against the windows, muting the light. Sarah and Miles worked side by side, boarding over the smaller gaps, setting buckets of water by the door in case fire was thrown. She boiled more on the hearth, the steam mingling with the smoke from the chimney. The first shot cracked through the storm, splintering a piece of the shutter. Miles returned fire immediately, his movements precise and unhurried despite the chaos outside. Sarah crouched at the smaller window near the hearth, the revolver cold in her hands. Through the swirling snow, she saw a figure dart from one tree to another, a flash of dark coat, the glint of metal. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil jarred her wrist, but the figure dropped into the snow and didn't rise. Her stomach lurched. She hadn't meant to kill, but there was no room for regret now. Not when Hannah and Thomas huddled under the bed, their eyes wide and unblinking. The storm thickened, blurring the line between tree and man. Shadows moved closer. One of them tossed something, a burning rag wrapped around a bottle. Miles was already there, kicking it away from the wall, dousing it with the boiling water Sarah had set ready. The hiss was sharp, the smell of scorched alcohol filling the cabin. "Board that gap!" he shouted over the wind. She grabbed the loose plank and hammered it into place, the nails biting deep into the wood. A second Molotov came, shattering against the snowbank near the door. Heat flared briefly, then the storm snuffed it out. The fight dragged on. Bursts of gunfire, the thud of boots in snow, the shouts of men trying to be heard over the wind. Sarah reloaded with fingers numb from cold and fear, each metallic click a small act of defiance. Then came the closest call yet. A man broke from cover and charged the door, axe in hand. Miles's rifle barked once, dropping him before he could swing, but the blow had landed in Sarah's mind. This wasn't just a siege. They meant to tear the cabin apart, piece by piece. Through the chaos, Sarah noticed something shift in Miles. His aim became more deliberate, his shots more controlled. Not the frenzy of a man under attack, but the calm of someone who'd been here before. She realized he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was sending a message. An hour passed before the gang's shouts began to fade. The storm had deepened into a white wall, and visibility was down to a few yards. A final shot cracked in the distance, then silence, only the moan of wind through the pines. Miles lowered his rifle but didn't relax. They've lost 2 men. That's enough for tonight. But they'll be back. Sarah set the revolver on the table, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. Then we'll be ready, she said, and meant it. Miles glanced toward the bed where Hannah and Thomas were crawling out from their hiding place. You did well, he told her. Most folks freeze their first time under fire. I don't have the luxury, she replied. They worked together to repair what they could, nailing loose boards, adding more snow to the drifts against the walls, banked high to insulate and shield. The bodies outside would be claimed by the storm before morning. When the last nail was driven, Sarah sank into the chair by the hearth, exhaustion settling heavy on her. Miles poured 2 mugs of strong coffee, handing one to her. We bought ourselves a night, he said. She sipped, the bitter heat grounding her. Then we'll use it. Somewhere out in the white darkness, Jed Malone was still there, watching, waiting. She could feel it like a weight pressing against the walls. And she knew that whatever came next would be harder, colder, and far more dangerous than tonight had been. But she also knew this. She was no longer the frightened widow who'd stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek. The siege had burned that woman away, leaving someone new, someone ready to fight for the small, fragile piece of the world she'd claimed. The storm roared on, the night held its breath, and in the heart of the mountains, 2 people prepared for whatever would come when the snow cleared. The blizzard did not let up. By dawn, the cabin was buried to the windowsills, and the wind screamed through the pines like 100 voices calling at once. Sarah had not slept. None of them had. The gang hadn't returned during the night, but Miles warned that was no comfort. They're smart enough to wait for the weather to work for them, he said as he checked the rifle by the door. We've got to outlast both. Sarah nodded, though her attention was already divided. A deep, rhythmic ache had been growing low in her belly since the darkest hours of the night. She had ignored it at first, telling herself it was the strain of the siege. But now, standing by the hearth and stirring the last of the dried beans into the pot, the truth pressed in on her. The baby was coming. She gripped the table until the wave of pain eased. The children were still wrapped in blankets by the fire. Hannah reading softly from the one book they'd brought, Thomas playing with his rag horse. Miles noticed her stillness and frowned. You all right? She swallowed hard. Not exactly. It's time. His eyes widened just enough to betray his surprise before he masked it. In this storm? As if I had a choice, she said through a tight breath. He set the rifle down and was beside her in 3 strides. All right, we work with what we have. You've done this before? Twice, she said. But never without a midwife. Miles didn't flinch. Then I'll be your midwife. The words should have been absurd, but there was no humor in them, only resolve. He moved quickly, stoking the fire higher, dragging the heavy table closer for space to work, and heating water in the largest pot they had. "Kids," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You're going to stay wrapped up right there and keep reading to each other. Mama needs quiet." Hannah's eyes were wide, but she nodded, pulling Thomas closer. Sarah sank onto the bed as another contraction gripped her. The storm's howl became a background roar to the drumbeat of pain and her own ragged breathing. Miles knelt beside the bed, rolling up his sleeves. "I'll need clean cloths," she managed. "They're in the trunk by the hearth," he said without looking away from her. "I already boiled water for them." The next hours blurred into a rhythm of pain, breathing, and Miles's calm instructions. His hands were steady, his voice low and sure. He held her when the worst of the contractions came, bracing her as though he could carry some of the strain himself. Outside, the wind battered the shutters, rattling them like angry fists. Once, in the middle of a contraction, Sarah thought she heard a faint shout through the storm, Jed Malone's voice, but it was swallowed quickly by the blizzard. "They won't get in," Miles said, as if reading her mind. "Not tonight." Another wave of pain tore through her, and she cried out despite herself. Miles pressed a cloth to her forehead. "You're doing fine," he murmured. "Almost there." The hours stretched. Sweat beaded on her skin despite the cold, her fingers gripping the bed frame hard enough to ache. She thought of Kansas, of the night she'd lost her husband, of the long road west and the faces of the men who'd taken everything from her. But she also thought of the look in Miles's eyes when he'd taken her dollar, how it hadn't been greed, but something like promise. Finally, as the storm began to ease from a scream to a steady moan, the moment came. One final push, one sharp cry, and Miles lifted a tiny, wailing bundle into the lantern light. "It's a girl," he said, wonder breaking through his usual guarded tone. Sarah's arms opened instinctively. Miles wrapped the newborn in a wool blanket and laid her gently in her mother's embrace. The child's skin was warm against her own, her cries strong. "Hope," Sarah whispered. "Her name is Hope." Miles nodded, as though the name was one he'd been waiting to hear all along. "Fitting," he said softly. For a few precious moments, the siege, the cold, and the danger outside faded away. Hannah and Thomas crept closer, peering over the edge of the bed with wide eyes. Hannah reached out a tentative hand to touch her sister's cheek, while Thomas clutched the rag horse as if offering it in welcome. But the world outside had not gone away. Miles's head lifted at a sound, a faint crunching in the snow beyond the clearing. He rose, moving silently to the window, and parted the shutter just enough to peer out. When he came back, his expression was unreadable. "They're still out there," he said quietly. "They'll wait for the weather to clear before they try again. But they saw the smoke from the chimney. They'll know we're alive, and that you've got another mouth to feed." Sarah looked down at Hope, her tiny fists curling against the blanket. "Then we'll be ready," she said. Miles met her gaze and nodded. "We will." That night, they kept the fire burning high. The storm had taken much of their strength, but it had also given them something the gang could never take. One more reason to fight. One more life to protect. In the dark hours before dawn, as the wind finally began to soften, Sarah lay awake. Hope nestled beside her and listened to the steady sound of Miles's boots pacing near the door. His shadow passed again and again across the lamplight, a silent promise that whatever waited beyond the pines, they would face it together. And when morning came, the snow lay deep and untouched in the clearing, as if the storm had buried not just the tracks of their enemies, but the woman she used to be. Spring crept into the mountains like a cautious visitor. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, revealing patches of brown grass and the stubborn green tips of early shoots. The air softened, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine sap. For the first time in months, Sarah could step outside without the wind biting her cheeks raw. Hope had grown in the long winter, her cries now a steady music in the cabin. Hannah and Thomas had found their laughter again, racing each other in the clearing while Sarah hung blankets to air. Miles worked in the yard, splitting wood with smooth, practiced swings, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. He was quieter than usual, though, watchful in a way that told Sarah he still expected trouble. "We should start a garden," she said one morning, standing beside him as he inspected the thawing soil near the cabin. He nodded. "Potatoes, carrots, maybe some beans, anything that'll store easy." They spent the next week digging and planting, turning the earth with the same determination they'd used to survive the winter. Hannah carried seeds in a small tin, solemnly handing them to her mother one by one. Thomas followed with the watering can, spilling as much on his boots as on the soil. It felt almost normal, until the day the trader arrived. His name was Caleb Doss, a wiry man with a cart pulled by a stubborn mule. He came up the trail just before noon, his breath misting in the cool air. "Rourke," he called when he saw Miles. "I figured you'd be needing supplies after a winter like this." Miles wiped his hands on a rag. "I do. Flour, salt, coffee if you've got it." Caleb grinned, showing a missing tooth. "Got all that, and news too. Dusty Creek's been buzzing about you." Sarah, standing on the cabin porch with Hope in her arms, felt her stomach tighten. "Buzzing how?" Caleb shrugged as he unloaded a sack of flour. "Somebody in town called you Ridge Runner." Took me a minute to remember why the name sounded familiar. Back before I went straight, I used to hear it whispered in saloons. Meant you were trouble to the wrong kind of people and a headache to the law. Miles's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw the faint tightening at the corners of his eyes. "Old name," he said flatly. Caleb chuckled. "Old names have long shadows. You might want to watch how far they reach." Sarah carried the flour inside, but the weight in her chest was heavier than the sack. When Miles came in later, she set Hope in her cradle and faced him. "Ridge Runner?" He met her gaze without flinching. "That's what they used to call me, back when I rode with men like Jed Malone." "And now everyone in Dusty Creek knows," she said quietly. "Not everyone," he replied, "but enough that word could travel. Men like Malone have a way of hearing their enemies' names, no matter how far they are." The garden, the warm days, the small sense of peace, they all felt more fragile now. Each creak of the pines could have been a boot on the trail. Over the next weeks, Sarah saw the change in him. Miles ranged farther when he hunted, his eyes always scanning the ridges. He built a second smokehouse, stocked it with meat, and quietly showed Sarah where he kept extra ammunition. One afternoon, while she was weeding the garden, Hannah came running from the tree line, her face pale. "Mama! There's a man on the trail!" Miles appeared from the cabin before Sarah could move, rifle in hand. They waited at the edge of the clearing until the figure emerged, a trapper named Holt, who sometimes passed through the high country. Holt greeted Miles with a grin. "Heard you were still alive, Ridge Runner. Some folks in town were taking bets." Miles didn't smile. "And what did you tell them?" "Nothing worth remembering," Holt said. "But if you're smart, you'll head south before the summer drives the snow off the passes. Heard Malone's been seen in the low country." After Holt left, Sarah found Miles on the porch, staring out at the mountains. "You're thinking about leaving," she said. "I'm thinking about keeping you all alive," he answered. She stepped closer. "We can't spend the rest of our lives running from your past." His jaw worked, but he said nothing. That night, as the children slept, Sarah sat at the table with a needle and thread, patching one of Miles's shirts. The lamplight cast his shadow large against the wall as he worked at the rifle. "You once told me you heard my prayer years ago," she said. "If that's true, maybe you were meant to be here now. With us. Not out there, chasing ghosts." He looked at her for a long time. "Ghosts have a way of chasing back," he said finally. But he didn't argue when she reached across the table and set her hand over his. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called. Sarah listened, holding on to the quiet moments while they lasted, knowing they could shatter at any time. Because now the whole town, or close enough, knew that Miles Rourke was Ridge Runner. And men like Jed Malone didn't forget a name like that. The first shot came before the sun touched the peaks. Sarah woke to the crack of a rifle, sharp and close enough to rattle the shutters. She sat up in the dim light, heart pounding, and reached instinctively for Hope's cradle. The baby stirred but didn't cry. Hannah and Thomas were still asleep, their small bodies curled together under the blankets. Miles was already on his feet, loading shells into his Winchester. "They're here," he said in a voice low and steady. Malone brought more men this time. Sarah didn't ask how he knew it was Malone. The sound of boots crunching over frost outside told her enough. "Take the kids to the root cellar," Miles ordered. "Keep low. Stay quiet. Come back when I call for you." She hesitated. "I'm not hiding while you fight alone." His eyes cut to hers, hard but not unkind. "You'll get your turn. First, make sure they're safe." Sarah moved fast, bundling Hope against her chest and shaking Hannah and Thomas awake. They followed without protest, sensing the danger in her voice. The root cellar was dug into the slope behind the cabin, its low door hidden by stacked wood and a screen of brush. She tucked them inside with blankets and the small lantern, pressing a kiss to each head. "I'll be back," she promised, though the words felt too small for what was outside. When she returned, Miles was crouched by the front window, scanning the tree line. She took her place at the smaller window near the hearth, revolver in hand. The clearing was alive with movement, shadows darting between pines, flashes of steel and leather. The morning light was pale, barely enough to cut through the mist rising off the melting snow. Then she saw him, Jed Malone. Broad-shouldered, his coat the color of dried blood, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over a face carved in hard lines. Even at a distance, his grin was visible, slow and deliberate. "Miles Rourke," Malone's voice rolled across the clearing. "Time to settle accounts. You left us in the canyon with nothing but dust and lead. I aim to pay you back." Miles leaned out the window and fired, the crack echoing off the ridges. One of Malone's men fell into the snow, the rest scattered, shouting to one another. "They'll come from both sides," Miles said. "We use the terrain, draw them in close." Sarah nodded, moving to the back door. They had prepared for this. Weeks of setting traps in the trees, stringing tripwires, and digging shallow pits masked with brush. The first wave came from the east. 2 men broke from cover, sprinting low. Sarah fired, missing the first, but clipping the second in the shoulder. He stumbled, swearing, before a hidden snare yanked him off his feet. From the west, another pair charged. Miles dropped one with a clean shot, then shifted to the second, who dove behind a fallen log. Bullets splintered the wood around the cabin, the sound a harsh counterpoint to the steady rhythm of Miles's rifle. Smoke began to curl from the chimney, thick, dark, unnatural. Sarah's stomach clenched. They've set something burning. Miles cursed under his breath. Go, check the back wall. She ran outside, keeping low, and found a small bundle of rags smoldering against the logs. She kicked it into the snow, stamping out the last ember. A shot cracked nearby, throwing splinters from the wood above her head. She dropped behind the woodpile, heart hammering, then fired twice toward the flash of movement in the trees. The gunfire ebbed for a moment, replaced by shouts. Push in. Take the cabin! Sarah dashed back inside. Miles had moved to the loft, firing through the narrow window there. They'll rush in the next minute, he called down. Get ready! She positioned herself behind the table they'd turned on its side for cover. The air inside the cabin was hot with gunpowder, the smell clinging to her tongue. Then the front door shuddered under a heavy blow. A second hit splintered the frame. Miles fired from above, dropping the man with the ram. But another was already there to take his place. Now! Miles shouted. Sarah grabbed the bucket of boiling water from the hearth and heaved it toward the gap as the door cracked open. A scream followed, raw and sharp, and the man fell back into the snow. The pause was enough for Miles to drop from the loft, rifle in hand. He fired twice through the doorway, then slammed it shut again. That's 2 down, he said between breaths. 5, maybe 6 to go. Malone's voice rose again from the trees. Colder now. You can't win, Rourke. You've got a woman and 3 brats to protect. How long you think you can keep that up? Miles's jaw tightened. Long enough to see you dead, he muttered. The next rush came from the back. Sarah heard the crunch of boots and swung the rear door open just as 2 men emerged from the pines. She fired once, hitting the laid man square in the chest. The second lunged toward her, but his boot caught the edge of a pit they'd dug weeks ago. He went down hard. The wind knocked out of him, and Miles finished it with a single shot. The clearing fell silent except for the wind. No more shouts, no more movement, just the slow drip of snowmelt from the pines. They'll pull back, Miles said finally. They lost too many to press today. Sarah lowered the revolver, her arms trembling with the release of tension. And tomorrow? He looked toward the tree line, where Malone's red coat had disappeared. Tomorrow we'll be ready again? But this isn't over. They spent the rest of the morning resetting traps and checking the perimeter. The children emerged from the root cellar wide-eyed but unhurt, clinging to Sarah until the smell of breakfast coaxed them inside. As they ate, Sarah glanced at Miles across the table. His face was grim, but there was something else there too. A spark of respect, maybe even pride. They had fought together and held their ground. But she knew Malone wasn't the type to give up. And the next time he came, it might not be at dawn. The fire burned low, throwing long shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the night was still, the kind of quiet that comes only after violence, a silence heavy with the weight of what might return. The children were asleep in the bed. Hope nestled between Hannah and Thomas, her small breaths even and warm. Sarah sat at the table with a mug of coffee, though it had long gone cold. Across from her, Miles was cleaning his rifle, movements slow and deliberate, as if each pass of the cloth bought him time to think. "You haven't said much since this morning," Sarah said finally. He didn't look up. "Not much to say. We lived. They didn't." "That's not all that's on your mind," she pressed. He glanced at her then, and she saw it. Something deeper. Something that had been weighing on him longer than this fight with Malone. He set the rifle aside and leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the flicker of the fire. "There's something I never told you," he said. Sarah's pulse quickened. "Go on." "Years ago, before Kansas, before I was Ridge Runner, I had a dream," he began. "I was camped out in the high desert, just me and the stars. I fell asleep by the fire, and I heard a voice. A woman's voice calling my name. Not shouting, not begging, just calling, like she knew I'd hear." Sarah's breath caught. "I woke up, and there was nothing," Miles went on. "Just the wind in the sage, but the voice stayed with me. I kept hearing it in my head, clear as anything. Miles. I didn't tell anyone. Men I rode with wouldn't have understood." Her fingers curled around the mug. "And you think that voice was mine?" He nodded once. "A few months later, I was riding escort on the Kansas City stage. You were inside, holding a baby. Hannah, I guess. Bandits hit us halfway to Abilene. I took out 2 before they could reach the door. You never saw me. I didn't stick around for thanks. I was already running from my own gang." Sarah remembered the attack, the sound of gunfire, the jolt of the coach, the terror that had gripped her. She had told herself for years that some nameless guardian had saved them. "Why didn't you say something when we met in Dusty Creek?" "Because I wasn't sure if I believed it myself," he admitted. "And because I didn't want you thinking I'd shown up here to collect on some debt from years ago. But after that night in the saloon, when I saw you again, I knew. The voice, the stage, Kansas, all of it. It wasn't just chance." Sarah sat back, her thoughts tumbling. "You think this," she gestured around the cabin to herself, the children, "was meant to happen?" "I don't think," Miles said. "I know. We're here because we were supposed to be. That prayer I said I heard, it wasn't just in my head. It was like the world telling me where I was supposed to go." The fire popped, sending a small cascade of sparks into the air. Sarah stared at the flames, feeling the truth of his words settle deep in her chest. She thought of the road that had led her here, every loss, every turn, every desperate choice, and how it had all ended in this cabin, with this man who had risked his life for her more than once. "You believe in fate," she said softly. "I believe in second chances," he replied, "and I believe we don't get them without a reason." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a weight between them now, but it wasn't the kind that dragged down. It was the kind that anchored. Finally, she said, "If this is fate, then it's not just about surviving Malone. It's about what comes after." Miles's gaze didn't waver. "And what do you want after?" She hesitated, thinking of the garden outside, of Hannah's laughter, of Thomas's stubborn little smile, of Hope's tiny fists curling around her finger. "I want a place where no one can take from us again. A place that means safety, not just for us, but for others like us. Women who've lost everything, people with nowhere to go." He studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Then we make it. Together." Sarah felt something in her chest loosen. Relief, perhaps, or resolve. She realized then that she had stopped thinking of this as Miles's cabin. It was theirs now, in a way the dollar bargain had never truly covered. The wind shifted outside, brushing against the walls like a warning. "They'll come back," Miles said. "Malone's the kind who doesn't walk away without blood, and next time, he'll bring more men." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure we're ready. For him. For anyone. We fight until they understand this place isn't theirs to take." A faint smile touched Miles's mouth. Not amusement, but pride. "That's the voice I heard," he said quietly. They sat in silence for a while after that. The only sound the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the children. Sarah thought of how much had changed since the day she stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek. She was no longer the woman who had been running. She was the woman who would stand. Outside, the moon rose over the ridge, silvering the pines. Somewhere in the darkness, Jed Malone might have been planning his next move. But here, in the warm light of the cabin, Sarah knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever was coming, she and Miles would face it side by side. By summer, the mountain had shed the last of its snow. The pines whispered in the warm wind, and the garden Sarah and Miles had planted was a green patchwork of life. Rows of potatoes and carrots, beans curling up their poles, herbs drying on the line outside the cabin. Hope had learned to crawl, her tiny hands slapping the wooden floor, chasing after Hannah's ribbons and Thomas's boots. Laughter, real laughter, had returned to the cabin. But under that laughter lay the memory of gunfire. The knowledge that Jed Malone still breathed somewhere out there. It was Sarah who first spoke the idea aloud. They were sitting on the porch one evening, the light turning gold through the trees. Miles was whittling a handle for a new axe, his knife making steady, sure strokes. Sarah rocked Hope in her arms, watching the child's eyelids grow heavy. "I've been thinking," she said. "That's never simple," Miles replied without looking up, a faint smile tugging his mouth. "This place, it kept us alive. More than alive. It gave us something worth holding on to. And there are other women out there. Widows, mothers, running from the same kind of men we've fought off. We could give them the same chance." Miles's knife paused. "You're talking about bringing strangers here." "I'm talking about building something more than just a hiding place for us," she said. "A refuge. A haven. Somewhere women can come when they've got nowhere else." He looked at her then. Really looked. "That's a dangerous promise." "So is keeping quiet while others suffer," she said, her voice steady. They let the idea hang in the air for a moment. A jay screeched somewhere in the trees, the sound sharp against the warm hush of evening. "What would it take?" Miles asked finally. Sarah had already been thinking about that. More rooms, a stable big enough for extra horses, stores of food, a way to signal friends without alerting enemies, and trails, hidden ones, for safe arrivals. Miles nodded slowly. "We'd have to work through summer to be ready before winter, and we'd have to keep it quiet in town. If the wrong ear's here, Malone won't be the only one looking for us." That night, they began to plan. Over the next weeks, the cabin transformed. Miles added 2 more rooms off the back, the walls rising from logs they felled together. Sarah and the children stripped bark, stacked firewood, and helped smooth the chinking between the logs. The stable took shape next, its roof of fresh-cut cedar filling the air with a sharp, clean scent. They built hidden caches in the forest for food and supplies, places marked only in a small map Sarah kept folded in her apron. Hannah learned to run messages through the trees, memorizing paths that curved away from the main trail. Thomas, small as he was, became the keeper of their warning system. Small bells hung from certain branches that would jingle if a horse approached from the wrong direction. The first arrival came sooner than expected. It was a gray morning in late August when Sarah saw movement on the far ridge. A woman on a mule, her dress torn, a small child clinging to her back. Sarah signaled to Miles, and they met her at the edge of the clearing. Her name was Ruth Danner. She'd fled a mining town after her husband was killed in a dispute over a claim. The man who killed him had decided the widow and her land were his to take. "We were sleeping in the barn when he came back with friends," Ruth said, her voice trembling as she clutched her boy. "I ran without even my boots." Sarah led her inside, settled her in one of the new rooms, and put hot food in her hands. Later, she watched Ruth's son fall asleep in the bed, his face still smudged with soot, and felt something settle in her heart. "This is why we built it," Sarah said quietly to Miles. Word spread, though never openly. A trader heading south might tell a woman at the well that there was a place in the mountains where no man could touch her without consent. A seamstress in Dusty Creek might slip a note into a customer's pocket. Ask for Widow Whitmore's haven. By autumn, there were 3 women and 5 children living under the cabin's roof, each with their own story of loss. Each slowly finding their way back to something like peace. At night, Sarah would sit by the fire, mending clothes or tending to hope, and listen to the murmur of voices from the other rooms. Soft laughter, lullabies, the sound of safety returning to people who thought they'd never know it again. Miles moved quietly among them, fixing what needed fixing, teaching the older boys to split wood, showing the women where the hidden trails led. He never said much about it, but Sarah saw the way his shoulders eased when the place was full, the way he'd pause in the doorway just to take in the sight of the cabin alive with people. One evening, as the first frost rimed the garden, Sarah found him standing outside, watching the smoke rise from the chimney. "You ever think this is what fate had in mind?" she asked. He glanced at her. "I think fate's just the start. What we do with it, that's the real story." She smiled. "Then let's make it a good one." But even in that moment, she knew the danger hadn't passed. The more lives they sheltered, the more enemies they risked drawing, and somewhere beyond the ridge, Jed Malone still lived, his pride wounded, his debt to Miles unpaid. The haven was strong, but Sarah understood now. It would always need defending, and she was ready for that. Ready in a way the woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach months ago could never have imagined. Years passed, but the mountains remembered. The seasons carved their rhythm into the haven, spring rains swelling the creek, summer sun baking the ridges, autumn winds sweeping gold leaves across the clearing, and winters that pressed down like a heavy hand. Through them all, the cabin stood, its walls darkened by weather but unshaken, its hearth always burning. Word of Widow Whitmore's haven traveled far beyond Dusty Creek. No flyers or signs marked the way. Only whispers carried along trading routes. Through saloons, across campfires. A mother in Abilene might hear it from a peddler, a sister in Wyoming from a passing drover. And always the instructions were the same. Find the ridge, look for the notch in the pines, follow the smoke. By the 5th year, the cabin had doubled in size. The main room still held the same stone hearth, where Sarah had once boiled water in the blizzard. But now there was a long table built by Miles, big enough for a dozen people to share a meal. 2 more bedrooms branched off the back, A loft above the stable held extra bunks, and a small chapel-like corner displayed gifts from those who had passed through. Handmade quilts, a carved wooden cross, a silver locket with no picture inside. Sarah had aged into the role the mountains had given her. The lines at her eyes were deeper now, but they came from both worry and laughter. Her hair, streaked with silver, was always tied back. Her hands as steady with a rifle as they were with a needle. Miles, too, had changed. The hard edges of Ridge Runner had softened into something steadier, though the wariness never left his eyes. He was a father not just to Hannah, Thomas, and Hope, but to every child who crossed the Haven's threshold. Hannah grew into a capable young woman, tall and sure, able to ride a mountain trail as well as any scout. Thomas, steady-handed and serious, learned the craft of carpentry from Miles and built a new smokehouse before his 15th birthday. Hope, bright-eyed, quick with a laugh, could split kindling before she could write her name. It was a summer morning when a group of travelers appeared at the edge of the clearing. 3 women and 2 boys, their clothes torn, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Sarah was at the garden fence when she saw them. She dropped her basket and crossed the clearing without hesitation. "You found the haven," she said, offering her hand to the eldest of the women. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "We've come so far. They said you would take us in." Sarah smiled. "They told you right." While the newcomers were fed and shown to their rooms, Miles returned from a hunting trip, a pair of hares slung over his shoulder. He took in the scene with a single glance, nodded once, and headed for the stable to ready more bedding. They didn't need to speak. They'd done this too many times before. Dusty Creek had changed too. The town no longer looked at Sarah and Miles as curiosities or recluses. People brought supplies up the trail unasked, left sacks of flour or jars of preserves on the porch. The church in town sent blankets in winter, and when trouble came, as it sometimes did, it was met not just by the Haven's defenders, but by men and women from town who remembered the day Sarah and Miles had stood against Jed Malone. Malone himself never returned. Rumors placed him in Arizona, in Mexico, in a shallow grave somewhere west of the Pecos. Sarah didn't waste thought on which was true. The mountain was theirs now, and no man's grudge would change that. One autumn evening, as the first frost silvered the grass, Sarah and Miles sat on the porch, watching the smoke from the chimney rise into a sky streaked with pink. "You ever think about how it started?" Sarah asked. Miles chuckled low. $1 and a bargain in a saloon." She smiled. "And a name I didn't know I'd already spoken." He reached over, took her hand. "We made something out of that bargain. More than I ever figured we could." The sound of children's laughter floated from the clearing. Hannah teaching a group of younger girls to ride, Thomas fixing the latch on the stable door, Hope chasing a pair of boys with a bucket of water. Sarah watched them, pride swelling in her chest. "You think it'll last?" she asked. Miles's gaze followed hers. "As long as there are people worth protecting, there'll be someone here to do it. And if we've done our job, those someones will be our own." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the porch. Sarah thought of the women who had passed through the haven, their faces, their stories, the way they had left stronger than they'd arrived. She thought of the children who would grow up knowing safety as a right, not a gift. "Even in the harshest lands," she said softly, "you can make something that lasts." Miles squeezed her hand. "You didn't just make something. You made a home." They sat there until the sky turned to indigo, the stars blinking awake one by one. The mountains loomed dark around them, the same mountains that had once felt like a wall. Now they felt like arms holding them, holding all who came here. And in Dusty Creek, when people spoke of Widow Whitmore's haven, they did so with a kind of reverence, not because of the building or even the people who lived there, but because it had become a symbol, proof that courage and kindness could turn a desperate bargain into a legacy. Somewhere out there, more women would run, more children would need a safe bed, and the trail to the haven would stay open. Because as long as Sarah Whitmore and Miles Rourke drew breath, the fire in the mountains would never go out.